Thank you, Allison. And thank you, friends in the AV department, for scurrying around and doing this. Can you hear a little bit at least now? I'm glad, because I have had a cold and my voice is not all it could be. I'm rather torn tonight because part of me wants to say thank you, Allison, for that nice introduction, and the rest of me wants to say thank you all for coming as the acting principal, so I'll say both things. When I was asked to lecture on pastoral leadership, which is what I take leading the sheep to mean, I knew I had to do something from the Bible, indeed from the Old Testament, if for no other reason than that's what I know best. I know that this is to be a lectureship on the practice of ministry, but I find nothing more practical than the Old Testament. What I've been interested in all my teaching life is the way the Old Testament feeds into the practice of ministry. The rest of it, all that other stuff, is really secondary. Within the Old Testament, I considered the lessons that we could draw for leadership, such as the lesson of needing to listen to those that have different views, or the lessons of having to wait until what God sees on the inside, humans see on the outside, to be a leader, from the stories of Saul and David in 1st and 2nd Samuel. I also considered the prophet Jeremiah and his own incarnating his people to God, and in a sense incarnating God to his people in the form of what have come to be known as the Confessions of Jeremiah. And I hope to get to that one of these days in the future. Of course, I thought above all of the many lessons for leadership in Isaiah 40 to 55 and the figure of the servant of the Lord, being with people and being gentle proclaimers and not overpowerers of people. Finally, I came to consider God's servant, Job, who in a crisis needed pastoral care and leadership, but found the wrong kind. And it's on this last lesson that I want to come to rest tonight. I must tell you I resisted this for some little time because of the radical nature of the lessons in the book of Job and because of my basic conservative bent. Job gives us a paradigm of pastoral leadership for tough times. And many people are having tough times in our churches now. I should also say to you that I've been working on this lecture for about 15 years now, more or less, in various formats, in various places, and so some of you may have heard some of this before and think, I think he said that to me in some context, and you're probably right. That's the way things get better, I think, is to keep trying them until you get them right. Now, in just a few minutes, I'm going to try some. We didn't do very well with the low-tech tonight, so I tremble before the high-tech of a PowerPoint presentation. But we're going to try that in a little bit. Sort of the same gremlin that took the microphones also took the remote control away, so I'll have to walk over there for the PowerPoint, but you'll probably still be able to see me, and you can just simply tilt the camera a little bit, and we'll do the best we can on that. Let me quickly define leadership as bringing others to fuller life in Christ. Nothing complex. Bringing others to fuller life in Christ. And that quick definition includes most different kinds of ministry. Preaching and teaching, and evangelism and counseling, and discipling and pastoral care, and on and on. You know, I wish, now that I think of it, I could have assigned you to read the book of Job about 3 times before you came tonight. I think the attendance would have been curtailed had I done so. If I remember my own pastoral reading, it didn't include the book of Job as a regular matter, and it could have, and probably should have. The story of Job is that a righteous, God-fearing man named Job is discussed in the heavenly council. And God says something very like, have you ever seen anybody quite like my servant Job? Isn't he a star? Isn't he just wonderful? At this point, one who is called the Adversary, kind of a combination spy and crown prosecutor, comes up and says, you know, Job only follows you because you've made him rich and prosperous. Take it away and see what he says. Well, God permits that to happen. And Job is stripped of most everything. He doesn't curse God, but he does question the Almighty thoroughly. Anyone who talks about the patience of Job has only read chapters 1 and 2, because he certainly isn't very patient from chapter 3 on. All the while, Job is being, quote, helped, end quote, by some pastoral caregivers in his family and his circle of acquaintances. At the end, Job is confronted by the living God, who meets his questions with almighty presence. Job repents, and in kind of a Hollywood-like ending is restored. Most scholars who have written on the subject of the book of Job over the past half-century or so have seen Job as a composite of an old story about a righteous man who's tested by God and comes through it in chapters 1 and 2 and the last chapter, or most of the last chapter, to which a later poet added the poems basically in chapters 3 to 42:6, 3:1 to 42:6. Now, I know very good and well that each of the sections of the book of Job has its own complex of literary and historical problems which it would take a whole series of lectures to unpack, and that won't be tonight. And aren't you grateful? Me too. The poems themselves could have been written any time between the 15th and the 3rd century BC. All of those dates have been suggested by somebody. Most have settled for a date somewhere between the 7th and the 5th centuries, and most have settled on the 6th. About the time of the Babylonian exile, because that Babylonian exile becomes a national expression of what the book of Job is in personal expression. But that's not the only time. You see, so is the Holocaust of our own century an expression of what the book of Job is about. You see, the book of Job is timeless. And it's simply about us. Now, we're going to get back to Job in due course, I promise. But I want to take a few excursions. We will get back. They're all germane to what I want to say about the book of Job. Let me first say to you what I say to incoming students at one of the early integration seminars now, but which many don't remember. Faith is basically not the state of knowing the right content, but of having a right relationship with the living God through Jesus Christ in the power of the Holy Spirit. Now is where I come to the point where I'm going to turn this machine on, and God willing, all will become plain. Okay, let's see what happens now. Ha 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 ha! That's one. I think that was my wife that applauded. This is going to be a diagram that was designed at great expense by my staff, my crack staff. Oh, yes. My crack staff. In this diagram, the circle is life. The arrows represent experience. Our experience of the world and our experience with God, living life. We have, coming out of that experience, primary faith affirmations. God is. Maybe God is good. Some other very basic faith affirmations. And as we go on living and experience these faith affirmations, or primary affirmations, take on the shape of theological formulations. We put them in certain ways after we think about things. God is good. We know God as Holy Trinity. We know God is good through the divine justice worked out in certain ways. Theological formulations. Now, as we live life, our experiences can either contradict or affirm and confirm these theological formulations, and if they confirm things, everything is okay. If they don't, we have what we call dissonance. Doesn't fit. If the dissonance has to do with the theological formulations, we may just call it cognitive dissonance. It's up here. If it's strong enough, it may be something more basic than that and go all the way over and really question those primary affirmations. And I've talked about that as pistis, the very nature of pistis, faith. Dissonance. Keep that circle in mind as we begin to think about the book of Job tonight. Oh, good. Off. You can't imagine how that is shining right straight in my eyes. Now, as soon as the orange balls go away, I will continue. The wisdom tradition of Israel and the wisdom literature that grows out of that tradition in Israel has a very practical approach to life. It's what I call the horizontal approach to life. By horizontal, what I mean is that it looks at the world and doesn't expect to get an answer from up there all the time. It works out problems of this world in terms of this world. One of the ways to see that is, for example, the relatively few times that the divine name is even mentioned in the wisdom literature when you compare it to the legal or the narrative or the prophetic literature in the Old Testament. For example, the book of Proverbs has about one mention of God for every 10 verses, whereas Amos or Deuteronomy have about one mention of God every verse, is how it works out. So it's about a tenth as much. And Job and Ecclesiastes are in that same ballpark. The wisdom outlook in Israel entailed a basic confidence then in the human ability to work out things by looking at the world, by searching, by observing. When we look at the wisdom literature and this basic horizontal stance, I want to think about the book of Proverbs as the baseline. The vast majority of the literature in Proverbs talks about how things work out when everything is on an even keel. It talks about the most fruitful ways to search for God as the good life, drawn from observation of the world. Now, a proverb is a general truth in a specific example. It is not a promise nor a law. It is a general truth in a specific example. But what happens when, because Proverbs are in God's book, we make the mistake to think of these general truths in specific examples as either laws or promises? What happens when Proverbs, either capital or small p, either one, are thought to provide the real, the only way to get the good life? Every time. No questions asked. If you want the good life, do A, do B, do C, and out pops, you guessed it, the good life. Such an approach is dangerous, but it may work a while, as long as everything is on an even keel. But then something happens that violates the rules. Our comfortable orientation is shattered by painful disorientation. Job, and Ecclesiastes too in its own way. Job reacts against using Proverbs, if you like, small or capital P, as theological orthodoxy, and seeing this kind of infallible way of putting God over the barrel and making him do what you want God to do. The book of Job may best be read when times are out of joint and we're painfully disoriented. Now, very few people would claim that there are no ways to live a good life. And the book of Job can't be accused of saying there are none. What the book of Job does react against, however, is wisdom as a set of rigid propositions which one simply follows to get the good life. Living life by formulae that unerringly may be applied to any situation. To say it another way, Job reacts against a kind of spirituality that saw living in certain well-traced patterns, repeating certain well-tried words, as so much plugging in your quarter and getting out your blessing. Job is quite sure there must be ways in which the good life may be found, but he objects and objects and objects. I've plugged every quarter I've got in that cosmic candy machine, and all that's dropped out is disaster. I've done everything normally necessary. I've named and claimed every precious promise, and I'm still suffering. Thus for Job and others like him. It was necessary, in the light of what life really looked like, to call into question the adequacy of those well-tested theological formulations, and in due course, even the primary affirmations. Now, there are always going to be those who respond to that kind of question in other people as if it were a threat to them personally. Job doubted that these ways set forth so clearly to him were the ways of finding the good life every time. But this doubt, exemplified in the book of Job, is not necessarily to be thought of as antithetical to faith and a great evil, but rather something which, as long as it remains a way station on the way to fuller faith, is useful in discovering and fighting through to that stronger faith. The book of Job, most especially, outlines this doubt in the interest of faith. Now, I want to talk about doubt for just a minute. It's an issue I face every day in people I encounter on this campus. I imagine many of you who minister out there are meeting it every day as well, so I'm not the Lone Ranger on this one either. I want to differentiate very carefully this kind of doubt from unbelief, which refuses to hold that faith is of any human use. I also differentiate this kind of doubt from pessimism, which doubts so radically that the good becomes impossible to conceive of as strong enough to carry the day. I even further don't want to confuse this kind of doubt with cynicism, which doubts so radically that good and evil become irrelevant choices. In an article a number of years ago in the journal Religious Education, entitled "Doubt is Not a Four-Letter Word," Ron Habermas differentiated doubt, the sincere question, from unbelief, the unwillingness to hear an answer. Another educator, Philip Phoenix, who taught at Columbia University for many years, wrote about constructive and destructive doubt. Constructive doubt, he wrote, is the attitude of the father of the possessed son in Mark 9:24, who cried out, "I believe, help my unbelief." Destructive doubt is again, according to Phoenix, and I quote him now, the view of cynics who are essentially faithless in the sense that they presuppose the futility of any sustained quest for faith. Abandoning the search for ultimate certainties, the skeptic unwittingly cuts the ground from under serious inquiry itself, thus discrediting his or her own activity of doubting. So much for the educators. The poets. The poets. They, of course, knew of this kind of doubt of which I'm speaking a long time before some of the rest of us got a hold of it. Two excerpts of 19th century poetry were taped to my desktop a long time ago and are almost illegible by time and coffee stains. The first comes from Philip Bailey, who died in 1902. It's from a little poem called "A Country Town," and the couplet is, "Who never doubted, never half believed. Where doubt their truth is, 'tis her shadow." The second couplet is found in that prince of Victorian poets, Alfred Lord Tennyson, whose great and long poem "In Memoriam AHH" was written on the occasion of the death of one who was at least a close friend, Arthur Hallam, in 1833. The couplets are from part 96, stanza 3, and very famous lines, "There lives more faith in honest doubt, believe me, than in half the creeds." So much for the poets. The Harvard social psychologist, Gordon Allport, posited some of the causes of doubt from his own Freudian perspective. He wrote, Doubts may be attributed to a history of personal trauma. Doubts are generated through unconscious attitudes toward parent figures, thus showing the Freudian part that I talked about. Doubts often correlate with an egocentric, self-worshipping personality. Now we better listen to this one. Doubts can be initiated by public hypocrisy and a failure of institutional religion. So much for the social scientist. I mentioned these educationalists, poets, social scientists, not to discuss their finding as such, nor to complexify the whole issue of doubt, but rather to show how many different kinds of people in our world at large really understand this business of doubt, and how long they have. I mean, the poets are 19th century. Alport's work is 50 years old plus. It's interesting to see how many points of contact these sources have with the Hebrew wisdom tradition without any overt recognition of that fact in some cases. Yet another educator, John Westerhoff III, who teaches religious education at Duke University Divinity School in Durham, North Carolina, wrote a slim volume about 20 years ago called Will Our Children Have Faith? By the way, if you haven't read that book, it's worth getting and reading. Will Our Children Have Faith? In this book, depending on some of the work that Fowler has done, Westerhoff speaks of 4 stages of faith. First, experienced faith. Experienced faith. He means experiencing somebody else's faith. I buy it because mom and dad bought it. 2, affiliative faith. Join up and see. Affiliative faith. 3, searching faith. More in a minute. And 4, owned faith. Owned faith. Ditto. More in a minute. It's the 3rd stage I want to talk about for a moment, searching faith. Searching faith is characterized by 3 things. Doubt and critical judgment, that's one thing. Experimentation, and the need to commit to persons and causes. He wrote, sometimes painful and sometimes celebrative, those with searching faith need to act over against the understanding of faith acquired earlier. We seem to know this, at least in terms of adolescent family behavior, but have neglected it somehow when considering faith. He continues, for example, my teenagers sometimes think I'm quite stupid and misguided, and while that's not easy to live with, it may be important for them to believe in order to acquire their own identity. The same is true of faith that is our own. We need to doubt and question that faith. At this point, the religion of the head becomes equally important with the religion of the heart, and acts of the intellect, critical judgment, and inquiry into the meanings and purposes of the story and the ways by which the community of faith live are essential. Serious study of that story and engagement with historical, theological, and moral thinking about life becomes important. The despairs and the doubts of the searching soul need to be affirmed, and persons need to join others in the quest for understanding. As I mentioned a few moments ago, the last stage in Westerhoff's schema is owned faith, and this comes as a result of maturation through the process of searching faith, not without it, not in spite of it, not by denying it. And importantly, the dynamics of previous stages come back so we don't ever escape entirely. As leaders, it is helpful to think about these matters in terms of ourselves and in terms of those we lead. That long citation from Westerhoff may have lulled you off into inattention if something I've already said hasn't done that before. He ended with an important sentence for our own understanding of our own response to our doubts and those of others, and so let me repeat it. The despairs and doubts of the searching soul need to be affirmed, and persons need to join others in the quest for understanding. The answer is community. And not just any community, for Westerhoff, Christian community. Community for, in, dedicated to the person of Jesus Christ. It must be in and for community, not apart from it, that we lead. Now, let's go back to the book of Job. As is well known, Job, the righteous sufferer, disputes, is a kind word, with three friends, another kind word, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. All through chapters 3 to 31. His friend's airtight case, at least they thought it was airtight, stated that all suffering was brought about by the sin of the sufferer. Job was suffering, ergo he'd sinned. Full stop. Job doubts that that theological formulation is adequate to explain what's really going on. At the end of a whole series of messy incidents, God shows up and confronts Job with divine presence. Now, some have said that in this confrontation we find an answer to the whole business of Job's suffering and his challenges to God. We need to be careful what we mean by answer. Because if what we mean by answer is that there's an informational exchange here, I don't see that happening. I don't see that happening in the confrontation of God and Job. Job does not receive any new rational reasons to believe that he hasn't had before. What was needed by Job was not only a recasting of his theological formulations, or maybe even his primary affirmations. What we rather find as a resolution of Job's doubt is rather the presence of God himself. Job, at the very end, near the very end of the poem, puts it this way. In speaking to God, he says, I'd heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Job, the righteous man who turned away from evil, I'd heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. What was it that Job had heard by the hearing of the ear all his life? I think the answer to that will demand that we take a close look at one of the chapters in the book of Job. I know you didn't bring the book of Job with you tonight, or I doubt very much you did. But chapter 28 is crucial to the understanding of the book of Job. This chapter is understood by most to be an independent composition. It doesn't relate a great deal to the context. Doesn't sound like Job at all. There are all kinds of problems, and I'd simply refer you to any commentary you'd like to look at for a whole list of the problems. There are lots of them. All of you who have been in my classes, and as I look around, that's more than one or two by now, will know that I'm going to say to you now, it makes most sense to interpret this passage where it sits in the Bible. That ought to sound familiar. Well, it does. It may in fact be true that this is a song or a text borrowed from someplace else, but it's here in chapter 28 between chapters 27 and 29 for a reason. All Job's life, he'd heard that Yahweh alone, that God alone, was the possessor of wisdom. Humans should forget about having it to any real extent, except as God doled it out. That's what chapter 28 is about, you see. About wisdom. Chapter 28 breaks into three parts. Verses 1 to 12, which deal with how clever human beings are in technology. The technology they have in mind is mining, not sound systems. Or the other thing. Verses 13 to 20 contrast that great cleverness of human beings in technology with how unclever human beings are at finding wisdom. You see, they can be as clever as they like and mine it wherever they want. They can't find it underground. It isn't for sale, even for the gold they dig out of the ground. And at the end of each of the sections, we have this little refrain, so where may wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? The third section proclaims the answer. God alone has the wisdom that people seek but can never find, namely the wisdom of providence. Yet, God has revealed some wisdom to humans, the only wisdom that's needed, namely 28:28. Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. Such a view of wisdom and life is basic to what the friends have been saying all through their arguments with Job. And Job himself understands it very well. If you have time, look up chapter 9, or look up chapter 12, or look up chapter 23, and Job will say it 3 times. He knows that. It's made clear that that's the kind of a guy Job was from first to last. Listen to 28:28. Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. You know how Job is described in 1:1? One who feared God and turned away from evil. I guess he got the message. Now, I've taken as a generality that isn't bad Old Testament theology, you know. And God himself implies it, at least partly, in what he comes and says to Job. The problem is that even though it's true, when it's moved into the specific case that we're dealing with, it becomes totally unhelpful. It was the framework of those friends that made it unthinkable for Job. Because you see, in his friends' mouths, what it meant was, turn away from evil, which your current suffering obviously shows that you've committed. And through all the twists and turns of the book, in as many ways as you can think of, and probably some that you and I can't think of, Job responds, I do fear God. I have turned away from evil, and yet my suffering continues. How come? So what chapter 28 does, at a point where Job and his friends have argued just about all they can and are getting nowhere, as argument many times does, what chapter 28 does is to summarize the issue at debate. The meaning of the way in which Job had always been told to get the good life. This way must have made sense once, but I'll tell you it didn't then. Job had what Westerhoff would call searching faith. And he goes on to describe his misery in chapters 29 to 31. I'd heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. What he finally confesses to God is that he sees that life and wisdom aren't as simple as he had heard they were. His primary experience, his seeing, made his secondary experience, inferred from others' experiences, to be nonsense. You see, it wasn't for Job any longer just a series of formulae of plugging in your quarter and getting out your blessing, as if God were the cosmic candy machine. And you see, theology, even moderately good theology, has and can continue to play a stifling role if we confuse its place. If we confuse theology with a relationship with the living God. If we confuse talking about God to knowing God. And that's an important lesson to underline. We must not confuse a relationship with God with the formulation of certain propositions about God, even Orthodox ones. Face to face with God is what chapters 38 to 42 are all about. And it's in that face to face that if there is an answer to Job's problem, that's where it's found. And Job doesn't learn any new doctrine there. He simply meets God. Now my eye sees you. Meaningful faith through doubt comes not simply by the acceptance of certain facts about God, nor their recitation, true though they may be. Job chapter 28 is a wonderful example of such facts in hymnic or creedal form. But more than an affirmation of true doctrine is needed for thoughtful, involved men and women. Faith finds its basic ground, rather, in a personal encounter with living, almighty God. And that's what enables Job to carry on with life. And so, Job has his encounter with God. What does it matter to us as Christian leaders that Job says, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you, and all that? That a living, vital relationship with God sometimes ends up ossified and legalistic. What does Job's struggle for faith say to our search for a paradigm of pastoral leadership and pastoral care in our communities of faith? Well, for the most part, the book of Job offers us a negative example of how to help others in those characters of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They started out all right, for we read, "Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this disaster that had come upon him, they came each from his own place. They made an appointment together to come to sympathize with him and comfort him. And when they saw him from a great distance, they didn't even recognize him. And they raised their voices, and they wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and nobody spoke a word to him because they saw his suffering was very great." Chapter 2. If they had contented themselves with being with Job to comfort him, without trying to explain things they didn't have the first clue about, if they'd simply wept with those who wept, they would have been much better off and much better remembered. Their problem was, from whatever motive, they decided that the doubter needed answers more than community and arguments more than presence. The result of that decision, that Job needed simply to be argued out of his doubts, is found in the long and tortured chapters of chapters 3 to 31. Now at the end, God doesn't underwrite such a model of pastoral care or leadership. For in 42:7, he says to Eliphaz the Temanite, "My wrath is kindled against you and against your 2 friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." In all his doubting, Job had spoken more of what was right of God than Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, the zealous defenders. Job had what Westerhoff called searching faith, but he did have faith. And faith in the question and key was not understood at all by Job's friends. They minimized it. They condescended to it and to him. I hope that very basic insight is helpful as we come to pastoral leadership stances toward others. Whereas there is a role for intellectual argument in helping people with some kinds of intellectual questions, the fundamental attitude of the community, including the pastoral leader, should be seen in a willingness to be with the doubter through the doubts, rather than to argue with the doubter. In other words, the basic pastoral stance for which I'm arguing is the stance of friend. Here's where it gets radical. Sorry if you thought it was before. The book of Job has a stout, some find disturbing view of what goes into making a radical friend. And for this one, chapter 6 is the focus. Let me talk about chapter 6 a little bit. The friends have been introduced earlier as people of high social standing like Job himself, who gathered all from all over to be with Job in his sorrow and his suffering. I read that from chapter 2. And they were okay until Job decided in his agony to express some of his doubt. Then, at the crunch, when Job needed a friend in the very worst way, he was met by theologians. And when he called for sympathy, he was met by a doctrine lesson. It wasn't that Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar had theology and that's all wrong. No. They didn't know the place of theology. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar and their modern counterparts seem to have thought that they were required to defend the Almighty God against this little doubter over here. And so they did. It is little wonder then that when Job first responds to Eliphaz, which is what chapter 6 is all about, it is not to his theological argument that he responds in some anger, I might add, but to what Job sees as betrayal by a friend. In verses 2 to 4, Job sets the scene for the discussion of friendship by saying his suffering is immense and God is the cause. Now, if you've read the prologue of the book of Job, he's not far off the mark. What is required in the face of this situation is illustrated in verses 5 to 7 by Job by saying that cattle don't bellow when they have enough fodder. And with change of detail, either do people. Job has looked for sympathy and has been met with the tasteless fodder of argument. So he has bellowed, so to speak. He needs a friend, but he's found none. So he says, I'd be better off if God would simply put me out of my misery and kill me right here, verses 8 to 11. Because he's neither the inner strength nor the outer resources, a friend, to face his life anymore. Verses 11 to 13. Folks, I know a lot of people that are right here that say, I don't have the inner or the outer resources to take it anymore. He was on the brink of disaster. It's in verse 14 that we find the startling definition of friendship, which is necessary in our world and with which I wish to conclude tonight. It's pivotal to the whole chapter, this verse, and scholars have variously translated it. Indeed, some commentators and translators find the text so distasteful that they modify the text in the interest of something more palatable. Some have found it to be a gloss on the text with no textual evidence whatsoever. Let me just give you a potpourri of translations. The old authorized version, the King James, is somewhat confusing. To him that is afflicted, pity should be showed from his friend, but he forsaketh fear of the Almighty. The New American Standard Version. For the despairing man there should be kindness from his friend, lest he forsake the fear of the Almighty. Even the New Revised Standard Version reads, those who withhold kindness from a friend forsake the fear of the Almighty. And this verse in the NRSV is accompanied by a little note down below that says, this translation isn't of the Hebrew at all, but of the Syriac and the Latin, because the Hebrew is, quote, obscure, end quote. Well, the Hebrew is a little difficult, but what's new in the book of Job? It isn't so difficult as it is shocking. The Revised English Bible and its predecessor, the New English Bible, gets closer. Devotion is due from his friends to one who despairs and loses faith in the Almighty. Or the New International Version. A despairing man should have the devotion of his friends, even though he forsakes the fear of the Almighty. Last of all, one of the best commentators I know on the book of Job, Norman Hobble, who's written 2 commentaries and a series of articles, translates it this way. A despairing man needs the loyalty of a friend when he loses his faith in the Almighty. Told you we were going to be radical. What a powerful definition of a friend. A friend is one who shows covenant loyalty, is the word. Chesed is the Hebrew word. Covenant love and loyalty, as if you were in a very contractual, covenantal relationship, is what's shown to a friend. And it isn't just an extreme case when the faith is lost, is exactly when the friend is most needed. That lovely Hebrew word chesed, steadfast, covenant, love, and loyalty, is what Job's looking for. To help him with his disaster. And he doesn't get it. And so the rest of chapter 6 spells out his disgust at these so-called friends. Job is looking for what I'll call redemptive friendship. And when it becomes obvious that his earthly friends aren't going to provide him with such, his friend paradigm is transposed, so to speak, into a heavenly key. And in chapter 16, Job looks for just such a friend from heaven. 16:19 to 21. I translate, even now, my witness is in heaven. My guarantor is on high. My interpreter, my friend before God, when my eye is dripping. He will arbitrate for persons with God as a human being does for his friend. And indeed, in that famous Redeemer passage in chapter 19, you all know the one, I know my Redeemer lives, very difficult passage in Hebrew. The Redeemer figure is clearly drawn on the paradigm of the ultimate friend. What Job is looking for is one who can be a friend. To be, as Hobble said, co-human in a dehumanized situation. When at least in the moment, such a friend does not appear. Job sighs in his last lament. Chapter 30, verse 19. One of the saddest verses in the Bible, he says, the jackal is now my brother. The owl is my friend. The only compassionate companions Job has are the creatures of the desert that hoot and howl in the night. How many persons do we know in the Christian community who feel that their only friends are their pets because they're the only ones that won't criticize them? They're the only ones that won't argue with them and will listen to them. Folks, I'm convinced that the proper stance is being with rather than arguing with. We'll never argue folks out of their doubts or into the kingdom. I've cited Norman Hobble a couple of times. Let me cite what he calls closing comments from an article he wrote on some of the laments of Job. And I cite it because I find in it such a tremendous personal challenge to me as I try to minister in this place. He wrote, "The poet of Job forces us to consider friendship as a radical option for life in an age of increased anonymity and contrived sensitivity. His word is more than a nostalgic glance at what appears to be a vanishing species. If education in the art of friendship is dangerous, the task of seeking a friend may be even more precarious. We, like Job, may find it relatively easy to discover friends or redeemers who will save our property from disaster. Advocates for the oppressed are also available, at least in small numbers. Counselors and lifeline operators will provide hours of compassion across a desk or through a telephone. But finding or being a friend who is more than a mate, more loyal than a kinsman, more empathetic than a redeemer, more trustworthy than a priest, involves the ultimate risk. Trusting a friend without reservation in the face of an alien world is a major concern for Job. Our temptation is to assume that we could be just that kind of loyal friend to others in need. The greater problem is our inability to trust anyone to be our radical friend. We seem to have lost faith in trust. Recent studies reveal that among clergy especially, this weakness is epidemic. In exposing three friends, the poet was speaking to all professional friends. He speaks in uncomfortable terms that are difficult to internalize. He says, it's better to suffer with a friend than to defend his God. What more can I say? An old rabbi tells the story of one who was angry with God for all the injustice and chaos on earth. He said to God, "Why don't you send somebody to help us?" And God said, "I have. I sent you." I could add, of course, that for Christians, it is ultimately true that God sent his only Son. And as the Father sent him, even so, he sends us. May this be a challenge that rings in your ears as it does in mine. Until we can clearly see, to be, to find such friends as Job and all his modern counterparts need to find. God bless you.